Hello, this is Katie Butts-Dehm, your biology instructor. Today we're going to talk about plant diversity. This is the second part of our plant science notes. So in all the other kingdoms, then the phyla are called phyla, but in plants, then divisions are the same thing as phyla. So they always call them divisions though when we talk about plants. Our first group of plants are non-vascular land plants. These are liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. So you may remember from our last section of notes that vascular tissue is tissue that transports materials throughout the plants. So there's xylem that transports water and minerals from the roots of the plants up through the stem and the leaves, so the rest of the plants. And then there's phloem that transports the sugars and starches that the plant makes through photosynthesis down from the leaves, down through the stem and the roots into the rest of the plant. And so non-vascular land plants do not have vascular tissue. They're the liverworts, the hornworts, and mosses. They don't have true roots, stems, or leaves. So true roots, stems, and leaves have vascular tissues. These ones do not. The gametophyte is the dominant generation. So remember from last section, the gametophyte is the haploid plant. That means it only has one set of chromosomes, and it produces the haploid gametes, which are the egg and sperm cells. Non-vascular land plants must live in moist places because they don't have vascular tissue. So they're not going to be able to bring the water from the ground up through the rest of the plants. They're going to have the whole plant having access to the water. So moist and humid places, that's where you'll see them, and they'll stay pretty much smaller. So this right here is just a chart showing the plant diversity. So the non-vascular land plants are what we're looking at now. They don't have vascular tissue, liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Then all the rest are vascular plants, and they are going to be plants that have vascular tissues. So there's spore-producing vascular plants, that's club mosses, horsetails, and ferns. And then we have seed-producing vascular plants. And they're divided into non-flowering plants and flowering plants. So you may want to refer back to this page as you go through each of these groups in your notes. So non-vascular land plants, again, the liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. The liverworts are non-vascular plants with a lobed or leafy gametophyte and a sporophyte composed of a stalk and a capsule. So here's the gametophyte is on the bottom, and it's sort of leafy, and then the sporophyte is going to be toward the top, and it has a stalk and a capsule. Liverworts have simple pores instead of stomata. Remember, stomata have the guard cells that open and close, and liverworts just have pores. Remember, they're in a moist environment, so they shouldn't need to close up to conserve moisture. Also, liverworts do not have a waxy cuticle. Again, being in a moist environment, the cuticle normally helps plants retain the moisture, and they wouldn't need to do that. So there's both asexual and sexual reproduction in liverworts. For asexual production, the liverworts produce gymme, and I've heard it pronounced gimme, and gimme cups or gymme cups, these little cups right here. And asexual reproduction just means that there's only one parent involved. So the new offspring are going to have the exact same genetics as the original parent. Sexual reproduction, they'll have a flagellated sperm will swim to and fertilize an egg and produce a diploid zygote. And then that zygote will grow into a sporophyte. So that's another reason these plants need to be in a moist environment, because the sperm actually needs to swim across to the egg. Hornworts are non-vascular plants plants with a thin gametophyte and a tiny sporophyte that resembles a broom handle. So here's the gametophyte and here's the sporophyte. Notice it looks like a horn. That's why they're called hornworts. But broom handle here for the definition. It's a thin gametophyte. It looks like a broom handle horn. Hornworts are photosynthetic, but they also have a symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria. And if you remember, symbiotic relationships are those where the two organisms help each other. So the cyanobacteria can fix atmospheric nitrogen. They can take nitrogen from the air and break apart those triple bonds and fix it into the tissues. And then the cyanobacteria get a nice place to live. Hornworts have true stomata, and they have a waxy cuticle. Mosses are non-vascular plants, because we're still in that group, with simple leaves that branch out from thin stems. And you can see these simple leaves branching out from thin stems. They become brown and dormant when they dry out, and then green again when it rains. And we have a lot of this type of moss around in Maine. I have some in my backyard, and you'll see it. It won't look like much when it's all dried out, but then when it's wet, you'll have this whole green carpety area. Mosses do have the waxy cuticle, and they have true stomata. They also have one layer of spiral leaves that have midribs. And you can see here's the gametophyte down here, which is haploid. And then what's going to happen is sperm are going to be produced, and they're going to go into the female plant, fertilize the egg. That will grow into the diploid sporophyte, which will be diploid. And then that's going to produce these haploid spores by meiosis. And we went into this more in the last section of notes. So there's three classes of mosses. There's peat moss, there's granite moss, and then there's true mosses. And this, you might recognize something like this. So you'll see the moss and just see the little green gametophytes, and then maybe a few weeks later you'll see the sporophytes there. So we just went through the non-vascular land plants. Now we're going to look at this seedless vascular land plants. So these are vascular land plants, and they do not have seeds. Instead, they have spores. So have vascular tissue, but produce spores instead of seeds. So club mosses are our first type. They're also called lycophytes. These include ground pine, spike mosses, and quillworts. And you can see the ground pines, the spike mosses, and the quillworts. Club mosses have vascular stems, roots, and leaves. So they have vascular tissue in them. They have a rhizome, which is a branching underground stem. So it has all the functions of a stem, but it's underground and it's going across or vertically. They have microphyls, which are little small leaves. Micro is small and phyll is leaf. They have only one vein of vascular tissue in their leaves. Club mosses have sporophylls, which are microphyls that bear sporangia. And you can see right here, here's the sporophylls, these little leaves, and then there's sporangia in them. And the sporangia are structures in which the spores are formed asexually. The sporophylls are grouped into strobili, which this whole thing is a strobilus, plural. There's strobili, there's 4 of them here. The sporophyte generation is the dominant generation in the lycophytes, whereas before in the non-vascular plants, it was the gametophyte generation is dominant, and here the sporophyte generation is dominant, and it's going to be dominant from now on, and that's the diploid generation. So ferns and allies are in this group. So ferns and their friends. These are ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns, which are a little different than ferns. So these have megaphylls. And you saw before that the club mosses had microphyls. Mega is big, so big leaves. They're broad leaves with several veins of vascular tissue. Megaphylls collect more solar energy than smaller leaves. Plants with large leaves can undergo more photosynthesis so they can produce more food. The ancient club mosses, horsetails, and ferns that you hear about were much larger than they are today. So sometimes when you watch a dinosaur movie or something like that, then of course it's all made up, but they might have a bunch of giant ferns and things like that in the background or in the landscape. So horsetails, these are non-flowering plants in genus Equisetum, or Equisetum, but I usually call it Equisetum. So it's funny because I never noticed these plants before, and they are in Maine, so you can look around for them. And they're non-flowering vascular plants. All of these are non-flowering. In the genus Equisetum, they only have one genus of horsetails. They have jointed aerial stems. So aerial above ground going up, and jointed, you see these little joints, and I can see them better on this screen, but there's little joints. They're about 3 meters tall, so they can get pretty tall. They have silica in their cell walls in the stem. So silica is like a glassy type of substance, and pioneers actually used to use horsetails to scrub their pots and pans. That's why they're called scouring rushes. So horsetails, because sometimes they'll look like horsetails if you turn that upside down, but scouring rushes because they used them to scour the pans, and that's because the silica in their cell walls. So whorls of side branches circle the nodes of stems, making the plant resemble a horse's tail. So now we have whisk ferns, and whisk ferns are vascular seedless plants that occur as epiphytes or on the ground. So epi, we're thinking on top of, and phyte, you usually think of plant. But this is a plant growing on, but it's not parasitic on another plant. So it's just kind of growing on there. It's not quite a symbiotic relationship. It's more like commensalism, where one is helped by having a place to hang out and the other one's not hurt. Most whisk ferns have no leaves or roots. A few of them have reduced megaphylls. So they were larger and then they got smaller. They have a branched rhizome with rhizoids. And remember that rhizome is the branch stem that's sort of vertical. And the rhizoids are just tiny little roots that don't really have vascular tissue. And also, some of them have a symbiotic fungus that helps whisk ferns acquire nutrients. And that's important if they're going to have reduced megaphylls and they're not going to have roots and everything. Whisk ferns occur in the southern U.S. and in the tropics. So we wouldn't see them here. So ferns. There's lots of ferns here in Maine. As you know, just a little bit ago, everyone was out gathering their fiddleheads, and you can see them in the grocery store. Ferns are vascular, seedless, non-woody plants. So they're vascular. They have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. They're seedless. They do not have seeds. They have spores instead. They are non-woody plants with compound leaves. They're especially abundant in warm, moist, tropical regions. You know, to me, it's kind of strange because I grew up in the area of Texas, Houston, and it's very warm and very moist and very tropical-like there. It rains all the time in the summer. The temperature's real high, humidity's real high. But we did not eat ferns there. And then I came here to Maine, and there's ferns everywhere growing wild. And to me, it's like, wow, look at those ferns growing wild. And then everyone's eating the fiddleheads. So ferns range in size from very small and moss-like to very large and tree-like. The leaves of ferns are called fronds, and many ferns have compound leaves. And the compound leaves are leaves divided into leaflets, and each leaflet looks like an individual leaf, but really the whole thing is the frond. Okay, and here's a leaflet, and this whole thing is the leaf. There's the petiole, which was a little stalk. And fiddleheads are new unrolling fern fronds. Right here is a fiddlehead. So you've seen those in the grocery store. If you don't know what they are, if they unroll, they'll be a fern frond. The diploid sporophyte generation is dominant. So remember that only in the non-vascular plants is where you have the haploid gametophyte dominant. In all the other plants, you're going to have the diploid sporophyte dominant. So a sorus is a cluster of spore-producing receptacles on the underside of a fern frond. So each of these little black spots, and sometimes they're different colors, well, all the same color on the same plant, but I've seen them orange or brownish or yellow or blackish. But right here, plural, they're called sori. Here's a rhizome here, and the stalk or petiole, and then the leaf blade, and then here's all the leaflets. And there's a fiddlehead. So again, the stalk or petiole, the blade, the whole thing is the frond. Here's the sori underneath. And here you can see the sporangia all underneath in the sori, and up close, each one of these is a sporangium. And then right here is the sporangia up close, and this will pop open and the spores will be released. So fossil fuels, we're going to look at carboniferous forests, because when you think of ferns and plants like that, then you might think of how fossil fuels formed. So fossil fuels are hydrocarbons. Those are molecules made up of only hydrogen and carbon, and usually they're long chains of carbon with hydrogen all attached. And primarily coal, fuel oil, or natural gas. Fossil fuels form from the remains of organic materials in ancient times. These combustible geologic deposits were formed from decayed organisms that were exposed to heat and pressure in the Earth's crust over hundreds of millions of years. During the Carboniferous period, more than 300 million years ago, a great swamp forest consisting of giant lycophytes, remember the club mosses, horsetails, and ferns encompassed the whole northern Europe, Ukraine, and the Appalachian Mountains. So everything looked like this, but not a drawing. And the ferns were huge, and different plants were really huge. A change in climate brought upon the extinction of these trees, and only their smaller herbaceous relatives survived to our time. Over time, water rose and trees fell, and then sediments covered the decayed remains of the plants. So here's our swamp. Here's water covering all the dead plants, and now there's animals, and here's rocks and dirt. And look, there's coal. That's where all the dead plants were. So sediment covered the decayed remains of the plants, that's the dirt over the dead plants, and it changed them all into sedimentary rock. And then the sedimentary rock applied pressure and turned the organic material into coal. Okay, and other things. So we haven't gone through sedimentary rock yet, but we will later on. But it's just rock where you get maybe layers and layers of debris form, and then they put pressure down and kind of all get cemented together. But there's the sedimentary rock, that's pressure, and then we get the fossil fuels. Our next group of plants are vascular land plants with seeds, okay? So they have xylem and phloem, the vascular tissue, but now they have seeds. And seeds are mature ovules, and we saw the ovules before. They were like the little seeds in the fruit in the ovary, but they contain a sporophyte embryo. So there's a diploid embryo, and it's enclosed in a protective seed coat, and they also have the stored food. So the diploid sporophyte embryo, the food store, and it's all enclosed in a seed coat. So this is a lot different than a spore. A spore is just a little tiny brown thing with a genetic material that'll grow into a plant, but it doesn't have a food supply, and it doesn't have a seed coat. So the seed coat makes seeds resistant to temperature extremes, and also they can survive a lack of water. But spores can't really do that. the seeds have enough food to support the seedling until it can exist on its own. So this is something about the seed germination experiment. A lot of people just assume that the seeds are going to grow better in the sunlight. So remember, in that experiment, we have Ziploc baggies with a damp paper towel, and we have corn and bean seeds, and we have some of the corn seeds are in the light, and some of the bean seeds are in the light, and then some of them are in the dark. Okay. And a lot of people, their hypothesis is that the seeds will germinate faster. That is the embryo becoming a seedling plant in the light because of the sun. But that's not really the case. Ooh, I haven't looked at my my ones in the dark today, so I need to. But my ones in the light, I see them when I'm going out my door because they're on that window. But definitely those are growing well. But these little embryo plants have food. So, and normally seeds are buried underground, so they really don't need to do photosynthesis at all until they actually come out of the ground. So seeds greatly contribute to survival of seed plants and to their current dominance. I mean, of course they do. These don't have to be in a moist place because the seeds will be fine without water and they can get spread out and everything else. The seed plants are heterosporous or heterosporous, but heterosporous. Hetero means other, right? Or two. And this sporus is spores. This means they have two types of spores, both microspores and megaspores. So a microspore is the male gametophyte. And the smaller one is the male gametophyte. And these are the pollen grains, and the pollen grains contain the sperm cells. Look, some of them actually look like little Mickey Mouses. And the pollen grain, that's pollen, and then the sperm cells are going to be in there. So a megaspore develops into a female gametophyte. So the larger one's the female gametophyte, and that is within an ovule. And too bad I can't get rid of my picture because it's blocking this picture. But you still can see the megaspore here, and you'll be able to see it in your PowerPoint that's in your in Brightspace. Here's the megasporangium and so forth. So it's a larger one. The ovule becomes a seed following fertilization. So after the sperm gets to the ovule, that's going to become a seed. No external water is required for fertilization in seed plants. So remember when we looked before at the non-vascular land plants, at the in particular we saw the liverwort, and there had to be a little bit of water in there because the sperm had to swim across to the egg, but not here. Just the pollen grain has to come over here, and we'll look at that a little bit. Pollination is when a pollen grain comes in contact with the female gametophyte. So pollination is different than fertilization. Fertilization is when the egg and the sperm combine and form the zygote. But with these plants, you need to have pollination first, the pollen grain coming in contact with the female gametophyte. Once the pollen grain is usually carried by wind or by a pollinator. So you've probably seen it when the trees all have their pollen everywhere and your car is covered with a layer of yellow. And we think it's bad here in Maine. It's really a lot longer and a lot more pollen in the Houston area. But it's usually carried by the wind. Also, a pollinator might be bumblebees, birds and bees, things like that. Will go to one flower and get the pollen on their feet and then go to another flower and, just get some pollen on the next flower. Once the pollen grain comes in contact with the female gametophyte, then there's a tube cell in the pollen grain, and that's going to direct this growth of the pollen tube towards the megaspore, the female gametophyte. So a pollen tube is a hollow tube formed by a pollen grain when it germinates that conveys sperm to the ovule of the plant. So the pollen grain is here. Here's the tube cell makes the tube. And then here's the sperm going down the tube cell toward the ovules. Seeded vascular plants all have megaphylls, all of them. And again, mega is big and phyll is leaf. And you can see they have branching veins or vascular tissue. Some have parallel veins, but they're big leaves compared to some of the little tiny leaves we saw before, the microphyllaceae. So for the vascular land plants with seeds, we have two groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms are a type of woody seed plant, so they'll be like trees with wood on the stem. And the seeds are usually located in cones, such as in conifers, and the seeds are not enclosed by a fruit. So it means naked, basically naked vascular plants is what they are. And think of you go to the gym and you change out of your clothes, so they're naked seeds, no fruit. The conifers are cone-bearing trees and shrubs such as pine, spruces, and hemlocks. And we have a lot of pine trees around here, so you've probably seen a whole lot. The cycads are a group of gymnosperm trees and shrubs that have palmate leaves. They have massive cones. They're native to tropical and subtropical forest, and they're pollinated by insects instead of just by wind or by birds and bees. The ginkgo is called the maidenhair tree, and we have ginkgos here, but we only have male ginkgos. Ginkgos, there's both male and female trees, and all the ginkgos here were brought here. Netophytes are cone-bearing gymnosperms that have a number of similarities to flowering plants, so netophytes, and they have nectar and double fertilization. So you'll see double fertilization when you get to flowering plants, and that's where one sperm fertilizes the egg and makes the zygote, which becomes embryo. The other sperm fertilizes the food source, and it makes it a triploid endosperm. So that's unusual. And it's unusual that this is the only gymnosperm that does that. So here's the conifers right here. You recognize all those, right? Here's some cycads that you don't see around here, and you don't see netophytes around here. This is Welwitschia right here. But here's a ginkgos. And you know, from a distance, you can't tell a ginkgo from, you know, any other tree that looks like maybe a maple. You can tell a ginkgo from a conifer from a distance, but you don't see these leaves until you're more up close. Now our last one we're still on vascular land plants with seeds, but now we're on flowering plants. So our two groups in the vascular land plants with seeds are gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms have the naked seeds, they have no fruit and no flowers. The flowering plants are the angiosperms. They're the largest group of plants. They're in all habitats, and the flower is the sexually reproductive structure of angiosperms, which we talked about that a lot in the last section of notes. So the two largest orders of flowering plants or angiosperms are monocots and eudicots, and these make up 97% of angiosperms. So you may have learned monocots and dicots before, and then there was a little bit of taxonomy change, getting rid of dicots and then going back with it and taking out a little group of it. So there it is now. Eu means true, so true dicots. Mono means one and di means two, and cots is short for cotyledons. So that's really monocotyledons, and eudicotyledons or dicotyledons. A cotyledon is a seed leaf. This is a modified leaf that's part of the plant embryo within the seed. Okay, so a cotyledon's not a true leaf, and the cotyledons contain the stored food reserves of the seed. So when you eat beans, peanuts, or walnuts, then you're mostly eating a cotyledon, which is a stored food source. And when you have split pea soup, you don't cut in half every pea. Each side is a cotyledon. Just like beans, there's naturally two halves. And you can see you'll plant a bean, and maybe you have your beans in the closet and in the window right now. And then the first little part of the bean, the food source, is shriveled up ends up looking like half a bean, and then they end up as little shriveled leaves. Those are the cotyledons, or the seed leaves. And then you have the embryo and the seed coat. So right here, the bean seed, that's 2 cotyledons, or a dicot, 2 cotyledons. And you see the embryo with the first leaves and the little root. There's the cotyledons, 2 of them, and the seed coat. And then here is a corn seed, which is a monocot. It has 1 cotyledon. There's an endosperm, there's the cotyledon, embryonic root, and the seed coat. So monocotyledons, or monocots, are flowering plants with an embryo that bears a single cotyledon. Or flowering plants with embryos that bear single cotyledons. And here's some other characteristics of monocots besides the 1 seed leaf we mentioned, 1 cotyledon. They have parallel veins in the leaves. So if you look here, all the veins are running the same direction and they're not crossing each other, so they're parallel. Flower parts are in 3s or multiples of 3s. So you might look and see 6 petals, or you might see 3 petals and 3 sepals, things like that. They have fibrous root systems, so just a bunch of fibers. There's no single taproot. The vascular bundles are scattered in the seed. So to me, they look like little monkey faces, and I remember monocot monkey faces, but they're scattered. Examples of monocots are grasses, corn, tulips, bananas, lilies, wheat, palm trees, and palm trees such as the coconut trees. So if you think of tulips, because we get tulips here, then you see the leaves, how all the veins are going parallel like this. Eudicotyledons, or eudicots, and remember that was dicots. That's a group of flowering plants mainly characterized by having 2 seed leaves upon germination. So here's the 2 sides of the bean after the plant starts growing. And there's the true leaves, the seed leaves. So characteristics of eudicots: 2 seed leaves. There's net-like veins in the leaves. Okay, they're not parallel. They're not running all one direction. They form like a net. The flower parts are in multiples of 4 or 5. So you may have 4 petals or 5 petals, or maybe 8 or 10. They have a taproot system. So it's usually 1 big root in the center. If you've ever pulled up dandelions, then you notice there's 1 big root and then there's little roots coming off of it. The vascular bundles are arranged in a distinct ring in the stem. So eudicot examples are oaks, maples, birches, tomatoes, cabbage, apples, roses, dandelions. So here's monocots, 1 cotyledon, parallel veins usually. Vascular bundles are scattered. The flower parts are in multiples of 3s, 6, and they have fibrous root systems. For the eudicots, 2 cotyledons instead of just 1. The veins are usually branched. The vascular bundles are arranged in a ring. The floral parts are usually in multiples of 4 or 5. So these have 5. These are columbines. I have some in my garden. And then they have a taproot system, a single larger root with smaller roots. So what about this? Is this a monocot or eudicot? It is a eudicot, and one way I can tell is it has this large single root of the taproot, and that's a carrot, but also it doesn't have parallel veins. What about this one? That is going to be a monocot because of the parallel veins. And you can't really pull off the petals in this and count those in the picture. And how about this right here? Multiples of 3, I'm going to say monocot. And also the veins are parallel. But what about this one here? Eudicot or dicot. Here's 5 petals and it has netted leaf veins. And then this right here is also a eudicot. The corn You can't really see in this picture, but they do have parallel veins in the leaves. And if ever you go and get some corn at the grocery store that still has some leaves on it, then pay attention to the leaves. So what about this monocot or eudicot or dicot? Eudicot because the vascular bundles are in a ring, and I used to think those looked like Jimi Hendrix back when people knew who Jimi Hendrix was. And here's a monocot, and these vascular bundles look like monkey faces up close, and they're scattered, little scattered monkey faces, monocot. Oh my goodness, and that is the end. Look at all these monocots. If you have any questions, then email me, and good luck with this material, and have a wonderful day.